On November 5th, 2025, just past 4:30 a.m. local time, the port of Puerto Cabello in Venezuela was still wrapped in the hazy silence of early morning fishing boats slept in their berths. Sodium lights flickered along the docks, and the sea rolled in slow, steady breaths against the harbor wall. In that quiet hour, a Venezuelan Navy patrol squadron slipped out of port under strict communication silence. 4 small naval boats, fast, compact, and built for coastal patrol rather than deep-sea confrontation, moved together into open water. Each vessel carried standard defensive equipment common to older maritime fleets, but nothing resembling modern blue water firepower. Their orders were straightforward and administrative. Identify and warn a foreign ship believed to be approaching the edge of Venezuela's claimed maritime zone. It was supposed to be a routine intercept, the kind of assertive but typically uneventful mission that coastal navies carry out dozens of times each year. What these crews did not know was that their information was already out of date, and the sea ahead of them had changed while they slept. A moving piece on a massive chessboard. The intelligence summary received by the Venezuelan squadron described a single American destroyer operating independently several dozen miles offshore. That report was already 2 days old. Sometime during the night, while most of the Venezuelan crews were still ashore preparing for their next shift, the American vessel they believed they were tracking had repositioned and joined a larger formation. The ocean is rarely static. Ships drift, patrol routes evolve, and schedules shift to meet operational demands. What the Venezuelan boats were actually moving toward was not a lone destroyer, but an entire U.S. carrier strike group, centered around the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the largest and most complex military formations afloat anywhere on Earth. The Venezuelan crews had no reason to suspect such a drastic change in the maritime picture. Their equipment was older, their radar range limited, and their mission instructions clear. Locate the foreign vessel, send a formal warning to adjust course, and document the encounter for headquarters. For them, the sea ahead was a familiar blue highway. The idea that a massive carrier could be just beyond the horizon simply did not register a carrier that sees everything. By contrast, aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, commonly known among sailors as Ike, the morning began with a different kind of awareness. The ship itself is a floating city of steel with a crew numbering in the thousands, and even at dawn the decks hum with low-intensity activity. Long before sunrise, the carrier's advanced radar systems began picking up faint, sporadic echoes from the south. The signals were small, scattered, and moving quickly. Nothing like commercial traffic, and certainly not a deep-sea fishing fleet operators aboard the carrier strike group flagged the contacts as unknown small craft, the kind of notation that usually signifies a routine identification task rather than a threat. It was the same sort of situation U.S. ships encounter often while patrolling international waters. Yet, out of caution, the destroyers USS Gravely and USS Mason shifted slightly to form a protective geometry in front of the carrier. It was not an act of hostility. It was simply a well-practiced formation intended to ensure clarity and safety in case the small vessels ahead required communication or support. Misinterpretation at the edge of the radar scope. Meanwhile, aboard the Venezuelan patrol boats, a very different interpretation was forming. Their radar operators watched a large, indistinct return on their screens, believing it matched the approximate range and signature of the lone American destroyer they had been sent to locate. Because the older radar systems used on their boats were not designed to differentiate multi-layered returns from large vessels or tightly grouped ships, what they saw looked deceptively simple. To their eyes, the shape was consistent with their briefing. One ship, alone. And so the squadron continued forward, unaware that their instruments were painting an incomplete picture. The sun had not risen yet, leaving visual confirmation impossible. Crews manning the small navigation bridges scanned only dark water ahead, trusting the radar, trusting the briefing, and trusting that this morning would unfold like hundreds of patrol mornings before it. The first words. Across the water. At 5:48 a.m., still before daybreak, but with the horizon beginning to brighten, the Venezuelan formation broke its radio silence to send a formal maritime warning. They believed the American ship ahead was approaching their national waters and requested that it adjust course. It was standard protocol worldwide, calm, procedural, and entirely expected. These kinds of warnings happen in different regions nearly every week and often end with little more than a polite exchange. But on this morning, the U.S. carrier did not respond immediately. Not out of disregard, but because communications officers were in the process of verifying signal integrity, identifying the sender, and ensuring clarity before acknowledging. The silence that followed, however, created uncertainty aboard the Venezuelan vessels. Without reply, they were left unsure whether their message had been heard, and in that uncertainty, momentum carried them closer and closer to the colossal outline waiting just beyond visual range. The first glimpse of the truth. As the gap narrowed, the Venezuelan crews finally saw it, first as a shadow, then as a silhouette, and then as a fully revealed shape rising like a steel plateau from the horizon. It took only a few seconds for realization to ripple among them. The vessel ahead was far too massive, too broad, too tall, and too complexly structured to be a destroyer. Aircraft elevator platforms and the distinctive island tower gave away its identity unmistakably. They were staring at an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but one with an entire protective group of ships around her. Radios crackled. Crew members exchanged urgent words. The scale of the misunderstanding became immediately, undeniably clear. They were not nearing a small naval vessel, but one of the most sophisticated and heavily defended maritime formations on the planet. A mission that was supposed to be routine suddenly became a fragile exercise in course correction and careful communication. A sea full of eyes. From the American perspective, the picture was becoming clearer too. Helicopters already airborne for routine surveillance identified the approaching vessels visually, confirming them as Venezuelan patrol craft. The communication teams relayed images and updates across the formation, ensuring that every ship had the same shared understanding. The small vessels approaching were operating in an assertive but not hostile pattern. It was the kind of tense but manageable encounter that modern navies train extensively to handle without escalation. Still, formations tightened, and crews prepared to broadcast warnings if necessary. Everyone knew the goal was simple: to ensure clarity, maintain professionalism, and avoid any misunderstanding that could turn an already confusing morning into something more serious. The moment, the narrative. Nearly split in two. At a certain distance, the Venezuelan vessels slowed, then adjusted course slightly, an unmistakable gesture that signaled caution rather than confrontation. Their commanders attempted to clarify intentions over the radio, though channel interference made reception uneven. Between language gaps, equipment limitations, and the natural pressure of the moment, full clarity was difficult to achieve. Yet the very act of slowing signaled awareness. They understood they had misidentified the ship, and they were attempting to correct the situation. In response, the destroyers took on a protective but non-aggressive stance. They continued broadcasting safety messages on emergency maritime channels, signaling intentions through internationally recognized patterns meant to prevent misinterpretation. Everyone involved understood the stakes. Even a harmless misunderstanding at sea can spiral if confusion fills the silence. The slow unraveling of tension. As minutes passed, the Venezuelan patrol boats began withdrawing steadily, turning southward in a slow, deliberate retreat. The American ships maintained tracking, not as a threat, but as a routine safety measure. Nothing in these actions was hostile. In fact, the entire dynamic had become a carefully managed de-escalation, where both sides understood that restraint mattered far more than pride. One Venezuelan vessel lingered a bit longer than the others, perhaps seeking to finalize visual confirmation or ensure its group's safe repositioning. For a brief moment, its maneuver created uncertainty among observers, but once the vessel adjusted its line and followed the others homeward, the last thread of tension dissolved. When narratives collide, by mid-morning, the waters had returned to calm. The American formation resumed its course, and the Venezuelan squadron was safely headed home. But what happened on the sea did not stay only on the sea. Later that morning, Venezuelan state television aired a short segment presenting their patrols as having successfully confronted a foreign vessel near their waters. It was a political narrative meant to project confidence, not an operational record of the actual events. Within hours, U.S. officials released satellite images, positioning data, and navigation logs showing that the carrier strike group had been operating in international waters, well outside any nation's territorial boundary. Both countries framed the morning in ways that supported their broader storylines, something not uncommon in global politics. The event became, in the public eye, a brief diplomatic tug-of-war rather than the delicate maritime misunderstanding it truly had been. How simple errors become complicated moments. Naval experts reviewing the encounter later pointed to what they often call the fog of the sea, a term that reflects how easily misperception can arise when weather, darkness, equipment limitations, and outdated coordinates combine. Ships can appear larger or smaller on radar than they truly are. Wave patterns can distort signal echoes, and when regional politics run hot, even routine patrols take on heavier meaning. Much of modern naval safety depends not solely on machines, but on the judgment of the people operating them. A misread scope, a delayed response, a hurried assumption. These things have shaped maritime history far more often than direct aggression ever has. What happened that morning was, at its core, a human moment. Two groups of sailors navigating incomplete information, both believing they were performing their duties responsibly, neither aware of how close the situation felt from the other's perspective. And yet, through restraint on both sides, nothing irreversible happened. A reminder carried forward. Looking back, most sailors involved, from both navies, would later describe the event not with fear, but with a quiet sense of respect for how smoothly it was diffused despite the confusion. No collisions occurred, no equipment was damaged, and no one acted rashly. Everyone exercised the kind of professionalism that prevents minor misunderstandings from becoming major incidents. In the end, it was a story about awareness, communication, and the delicate thread that connects nations on the world's oceans. The sea does not care about borders, politics, or the narratives of governments. It is a place where misinterpretation drifts as easily as the tide. And on that November morning, two groups of sailors navigated not only the waters, but the uncertainty between them, and chose patience over escalation. A question for the viewer. So here's a question worth reflecting on. If you were the officer standing watch on either vessel that morning, faced with limited information, unexpected signals, and the rising pressure of responsibility, how would you have responded? Would you move slowly, waiting for clarity, or act quickly to avoid perceived risk? Let me know in the comments below how you think you would have navigated that moment. And thanks for joining this episode. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how small misunderstandings can ripple across international waters, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to support the channel even more, consider joining our community. Your support helps bring more thoughtful maritime stories to light. Until next time, stay curious, stay steady, and remember, on the ocean, clarity is the strongest compass a sailor can have.